Okay, so let's talk about structural violence. And this is probably the single most important concept in the whole field of critical violence studies. It profoundly changes the way in which we can conceptualize violence. So it's really important. And let's start with a little quote from James Gilligan. Who says, "Poverty kills far more people than all the wars in human history, more people than all the murderers in history, more than all the suicides in history. Not only does structural violence kill more people than all the behavioral violence put together, structural violence is the main cause of behavioral violence." So he's talking about the fact that poverty kills more people than all kinds of criminality and violence. Okay? And he's linking poverty to structural violence, and that's what we're going to try and understand today. And that's exactly where we have to start with the conceptual distinction between direct violence, which is the violence we assume. That's the stuff we normally think about. The getting mugged, getting bullied, getting murdered, getting assaulted. That's direct violence. You've got a person doing something directly to another person, a perpetrator harming a victim directly. And that's what we normally think about. That's what the criminal justice system normally thinks about. But now we're shifting into a completely different conceptualization, which is about the indirect forms of violence that happen. What are they? How do they occur? Okay, and I want to start by telling you two little stories about two guys, completely different, but within the same system, essentially within the American business and healthcare system. And the business and healthcare are kind of meshed together. Remember, we said that America was unusual. The United States is what I mean when I say America. United States is unusual in terms of homicides because of the incredibly high levels of gun violence. That for an economically highly developed country, it's very unusual to have this kind of rampant gun violence, mass shootings. And that seems to be a really significant problem which we explored. But there's also something else that we want to look at there is that United States is unusual not only in terms of gun violence, but in terms of healthcare. Okay, in that it's the only economically advanced country in the world that doesn't have universal healthcare, where you don't automatically have a right to go to a doctor, get treated at a hospital. That system is largely privatized and for profit. So you can only get the health care that you can afford under many circumstances. And what's interesting about this is when we look at the number of people who get murdered in the United States every year, maybe 16 to 20,000. And we look at the number of people who die because they have been denied health care by the private healthcare system. It's 2 to 3 times that number. It's like the last research I saw was 45,000 people a year. So yes, people are dying because of guns, gun culture, homicides, but people are dying because there isn't a universal healthcare system. And that's a very different kind of problem. And this is why I want to talk about these two people. On the one hand, Martin Shkreli. On the other hand, Luigi Mangione. So let me tell you about Shkreli. Okay, so why are we looking at him? He has committed no violence. He hasn't assaulted anybody. He hasn't, he hasn't been charged with any violent crime. He's just a regular hedge fund manager, CEO of a few pharmaceutical companies. So he's just a generic U.S. American businessman. Okay, and his business model is very specific. What his companies do is they buy these quite minor drugs, but drugs for which there are no competitors. Like if you have this particular, not very common disease, you have to have that particular medicine. Otherwise, you are in danger. Okay, so he would buy these medicines from the companies that had developed them, and buy the rights to sell them, and then radically push up the prices. So his moment of kind of infamy was when he bought this medicine called Daraprim, the antiparasitic drug, and it wasn't cheap. It was about $15 per pill. But he bought it and he raised the price to about $1,000 per pill. So he made it like 50 times as expensive, which obviously means that the many people simply can't afford it and will be very sick and may die because they just can't afford to pay $1,000 per tablet for this life-saving medicine. So what's the problem there? This is perfectly legal. It's not only legal, it's what he's supposed to do as a CEO. His job as a CEO is to maximize the profits for the shareholders of his companies. And that's what he's doing. It's a very effective business model. Get these medicines that people are completely dependent on, make them massively, like literally 50 times more expensive. People who pay will pay. People who can't pay, well, they'll have to die. And yet, when we look at this, we sense that there's something very wrong here. Now, in completely unrelated matter, Martin Shkreli eventually went to jail. He got sentenced to 7 years in prison for securities fraud. Now, this had nothing to do with his business model of buying medicines and making them extremely expensive. That was fine. That's completely legal. What he did is he lied about the value of his company and the shares, and he presented the value of his shares to shareholders in a way that exaggerated their value and risked these rich people losing some of their money they were going to make out of his shares. So the lesson here is very clear. You can kill poor people, but you can't threaten the profits of rich people. If you raise drug prices that people die, that's legal. If you present your company's shares as having more value than they have so that your investors don't make as much profit, that's a criminal offense and you will go to jail for that, and he did. And this raises a fundamental point I want us to think about. It's the difference between social justice and criminal justice. Criminal justice, Shkreli's medicine prices are perfectly legal, but scamming his investors, that's a crime. From a social justice point of view, we read this completely differently. That this is an outrage that this guy would deliberately raise medicine prices so that people couldn't afford them and die. That is an absolutely unacceptable from a social justice point of view. And this points to the difference between criminal justice and social justice. So why is letting people die because they can't afford medicine not a crime, but scamming your investors is a crime? For one reason, because rich people make the laws. And the criminal justice system is shaped by the people who have power to shape it. So this sense of what is criminalized, what you will end up going to jail for, is the kind of things that rich people don't like having happen to them. The kind of things that happen to marginalized people don't get well represented in the criminal justice system. And that's why we argue that to think about violence, we must think about social justice, not only criminal justice. Okay, so that's Martin Shkreli and his pharmaceutical CEO shenanigans. On 4th of December 2012, the CEO of Universal Healthcare, a private health insurance company in the United States, was shot dead by a person who had deliberately stalked him, waited for him to enter a building where he was going to a shareholder meeting, and killed him in a clear, deliberate homicide. Okay. Now, once again, we've got to understand the context there. The context is the fact that the United States doesn't have a universal public health system, that people have to rely on very expensive private health insurance. And the business model of that private health insurance is to deny people coverage as much as possible. Their profits depend on them rejecting claims. People say, well, I need heart surgery, I need cancer treatment, and them saying, no, we're not paying for that. And the more they don't pay for people's medical coverage, the more money they make. Okay, so this is a function of an economic system, in the same way that Martin Shkreli's making medicines 50 times more expensive than they were is a function of an economic system. This is what the business leaders of that system are meant to do. These are not crimes. These are them doing their job well. The trouble is that it kills people. And, although we have these, 15 to 20,000 homicides a year in the United States, we have, as we said, 45,000 deaths from people not having medical insurance and not having their claims made. Okay. Now, what was interesting about this is the guy who was arrested for the murder of the United Health medical insurance company became this kind of meme hero. He became the sort of online personality. There were these memes circulated of him being called Saint Luigi. Luigi Mangione is his name. So he became like Saint Luigi, the hero of the working people, the hero, like a Robin Hood, a modern Robin Hood figure. So while Martin Shkreli, doing his job as a CEO, became briefly one of the most hated people in the United States, Luigi Mangione, who did, well, he's charged with, and evidence is advanced that he murdered the CEO, and he becomes this popular hero, okay? So something really interesting is going on here, and what's interesting that's going on is that capitalism lets you kill some people and not others. Capitalism lets you kill people who can't afford healthcare, but it does not let you kill the CEOs of the companies that make healthcare unaffordable. So how do we talk about that? How do we talk about what's wrong with the economic system that kills people when we only have a way of thinking about the guys who actually commit the crime of homicide as a kind of rebellion against that murderous economic system? Okay, and this is where we need the notion of structural violence. Okay, so we already contrasted structural violence with direct violence. Direct violence has a perpetrator, an action, and a victim. Okay, the perpetrator is deliberately aggressive in some way and threatens or harms the victim in a clear way. Okay, and it doesn't have to be a physical harm. It can be a kind of psychological or other kind of harm. We accept that. We accept broader than physical definitions, but we're still stuck with that idea of a perpetrator, an intention to harm, and a harm. But how do we talk about the situation where there's no individual aggressor? Okay, there's perhaps no one who has the intention for this harm to happen. No one. Martin Shkreli never said, "Oh, I want these people. I want Jane Doe and John Smith to die because." And that's why I'm raising the drug prices. He never wanted anyone to die. He just didn't care that they were going to die. He just said, making a lot of money is more important than a bunch of anonymous people dying. So how do we talk about this? How do we talk about when the harm is not a consequence of a direct intention, a direct malicious intention? It's a result of a system. Okay, and this is what we're getting at. Okay, so here's some of the definitions we can look at. Human suffering caused by social structures that disproportionately benefit some people while diminishing the ability of others to meet their needs. So this is Johan Galtung, the guy who really developed the notion of structural violence, trying to define it. Okay, so he's saying it's suffering caused by social structures, caused by a system. And what the system does is it prevents some people from having their needs met. It harms some people. Not necessarily, by shooting them or punching them in the face, but by making them not get what they need to survive and to live a kind of life of well-being. Okay. Further, he says, the unavoidable impairment of fundamental human needs, or to put it in more general terms, the impairment of human life, which lowers the actual degree to which someone is able to meet their needs, below that which would otherwise be possible. So he's saying structural violence, it's not this kind of action that injures you. It's you not being able to live as well as you would live. It's you living in hardship, in cold, in hunger, at constant risk, all of those things. And the important things that he says there is that under conditions where that is not necessary, where it would be possible for that to be different, we wouldn't have to have people suffering in that way. So further, we see this quote that violence could be committed directly or deliberately, but can also be conducted indirectly and largely unintentionally by structures populated by humans. So what we're seeing here is a system that systematically harms certain people. It doesn't just randomly by accident harm certain people. It in predictable and systematic ways it harms people, and the people it harms are the people who are disadvantaged in that system, and the people it doesn't harm are the people who are privileged in that system. Okay, and this is exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing that that capitalism works to make investors and CEOs get super rich and have these fabulous billionaire lives, and other people to die because they can't get medical care. Okay, in the absence of some kind of intervention to stop that happening, that is the drift of that economic system. Okay. Another quote, structural violence is violence exerted systematically, that is indirectly, by everyone who belongs to a certain social order. In short, the concept of structural violence is intended to inform the study of the social machinery of oppression. Now, in our two examples, we looked at Martin Shkreli, this kind of bastard pharmaceutical CEO, and how he put drug prices up 50 times. Okay? But it's not him. He isn't the problem. The problem is that he is doing his job in a system that encourages and rewards people from behaving like that. Okay, so everyone who is part of that system becomes implicated in that harm. The politicians who support it, the people who collaborate with it, there's no intention. It's just you just are part of the harm by being part of the system. The other thing that to differentiate is this question of what the extent to which the way in which people are harmed and suffer is not necessary. Okay, so here we have Galtung saying the difference between the potential and the actual, between what could have been and what is. And here he gives a historical example. Thus, if a person died of tuberculosis in the 18th century, it would be hard to conceive of this as violence, since it would have been quite unavoidable. Okay, we didn't know how to stop people dying of TB in the 18th century. If you contracted it, there was no cure. But now there is a cure. Okay, so Galton goes on to say, but if he or she dies from it today, despite all the medical resources in the world, then violence is present according to this definition. So the difference between the 21st century and the 18th century, we can cure TB. The medicine's there. We've got it. So if someone dies of TB today because they did not get that medicine, that is structural violence. They could have been cured, but for some reason, for some probably economic reason, for some reason that was about making rich people richer and poor people poorer, they didn't get it. So people who die of TB in the world today, and there's still a lot, people die in the global south, they die in poor countries, and they die because the price of the drugs is controlled by Western businesses. Okay? So we see that those deaths are no longer unavoidable, and that the system distributes those deaths. The system says you, as a middle class person, have got really very little chance of dying of TB, but someone in an economically underdeveloped part of the global south has a very significant chance of dying of TB. Okay, so further quote, structural violence is visited upon all those whose social status denies them access to the fruits of social and scientific progress. So this is Farmer, who's an anthropologist who works on structural violence. So he's saying that structural violence exists where things could be better. People could have food, they could have medicine, they could have shelter, but they are not getting it. And they're not getting it because that social system is withholding it for them. It's withholding it for them because it's being inequitably given to someone else instead. So in this sense, we need to really think about the relation between structural violence and inequality. These are deeply linked. They're not reducible to each other, but they are deeply linked. Okay, so let's look at another quote. There may be any person who directly harms another person in the structure. Sorry, let me say that over again. There may not be any specific person who directly harms another person in the social structure. The violence is built into the structure and shows up as unequal power and consequently as uneven life choices. So once again, we're not talking about this bad guy, this mean person, this enraged, vindictive, sadistic person who wants to hurt someone. Okay, the violence just happens because of the system and because people are just functioning in that system. Okay? So again, violence is built into the structure and shows up as unequal power and consequently as unequal life chances. Resources are unevenly distributed. And not only are resources unequally distributed, but to conclude that quote, above all, the power to decide over the distribution of resources is unevenly distributed. Okay, so it's not just a question of, well, these healthcare CEOs, these pharmaceutical company CEOs could make things unaffordable, could deny health claims, could make people not be able to afford medicines. It's not just that they did that. It's that they had the ability to do that. The billionaire class, the people who become CEOs, the people who become shareholders, the people who sit on boards of directors, they have a power to decide who gets what in the society in the way that marginalized people don't, in the way that poor people don't. People who are marginalized on any other basis are excluded from decision making. And this is the way in which this kind of harm is systemic and systemically linked to inequality. Okay. And then we look at it from a kind of a legal point of view. Okay, we can say that structural violence does not require the kind of criminal intention to be violent or to harm. Okay, the mens rea, this like the criminal mind. And normally to convict someone of a crime, you have to show that they have the intention of that crime happening. In this case, mostly they don't. There is no criminal mind deliberately intending to cause the harm of structural violence. What there is instead is beneficiaries. Structural violence has beneficiaries. Okay. Another quote, the behavior of capitalist elites cannot be reduced to ordinary motivations like greed or domination, as greedy or as domineering as they may in fact be. When we are talking of class interest and of how individuals become personifications of great institutional forces, all the innumerable variations that make the human psyche interesting are subjected to a few basic rules, and a remarkable uniformity of behavior prevails. So here, once again, it doesn't depend on, the bosses of the gun companies and the politicians being paid by the gun companies or the pharmaceutical companies or the military-industrial complex. It doesn't depend on them being greedy or sadistic. It just depends on them functioning so as to pursue their interests in a system in which those pursuing your interests harms other people. Okay. And this is what's really interesting about structural violence. That structural violence is something you do just by living a normal life in a structurally violent system. And there's a lot of ways in which this happens. So just by putting petrol in your car, without any malice, without any hostility, you are engaged in structural violence. You are part of the system that invades countries in the Middle East, kills hundreds of thousands, millions of civilians. Just by getting a new cell phone, you are involved in the system of child slavery in the Congo. Just by having an ordinary meal of meat and vegetables, you're involved in the system of cruelty, by which animals are raised under cruel conditions and then killed in order to be sold as food. You don't have to be a criminal, you don't have to be a psychopath, you just have to do normal stuff like drive a car, use a phone, eat omnivorous diet. Just by doing that stuff, you are participating in a system of harm that you didn't create and that you probably wished wasn't there, but it is there. And so by participating in it, you are causing harm, even if you don't see that harm, even if you wish you weren't causing that harm. That harm is simply structural to that system. And this is a really difficult thing for us to think about. It completely shifts us away from criminal justice to social justice. It completely shifts us away from thinking about, well, who are the bad guys? How do we need to catch them and punish them? To thinking about how are we all part of a destructive system? Okay. And there, the notion of kind of negligence becomes really interesting. So it's not a notion of intention, it's a notion of negligence. It's not a matter of who created the system, but who benefits from the system. Who benefits by, just having convenient transport, delicious food, useful technology for work and socializing. Who benefits from that? And of course, within that, not just the end users, but the people who become the billionaires out of it, the people who become stupendously wealthy through the system of exploitation, through paying warlords to run child slave mines in the Congo, the people who are making the weapons of war and then getting politicians to pursue wars. And making their billions that way. So all of these systems have beneficiaries on different levels, from the billionaire beneficiaries to us ordinary people whose lives are just made a little bit easier if we are on the right side of that system, not on the wrong side of the system. If we're on the wrong side of the system, our lives are made much worse by it. But those systems are normalized. Those systems are invisible. They just look like, oh, that's just how the world is. And when you ask about them and say, but should it be like that? Then there are systems of explanation. There are these ideological systems of explanation that say, oh no, but that has to be like that. People are naturally competitive. Capitalism just rewards people for working harder and having better ideas. So the ideology of these structural systems makes them seem natural, normal, and inevitable. And often they'd also deliberately try and create a negative view of alternative ideology. So you see this in kind of conservative politics, like demonizing socialism and communism and making it seem like capitalism is like just freedom and happiness and good things for everyone, rather than what we've showed it to be in these examples, which is a ruthless system of murderous exploitation. Okay? So what do we need to do in this kind of context as people who are trying to understand violence, as people who are trying to move away from violence? We know what to do about violent criminals, but what do we need to do about structural violence? Well, we need to be able to understand the systems, okay? And here Rebecca Solnit sort of captures this in the phrase, revolt against brutality begins with a revolt against the language that hides brutality. Okay, so we need to be able to understand these systems. We need a conceptual language. We need analytic tools that enable us to look at something that just seems like everyday life and say, wait a minute, that is a system that is doing these things and having these effects. It's creating sweatshops in Southeast Asia where teenage women are living under conditions that are getting to the point of being life-threatening. It's creating child slavery in the DRC. It's creating wars over oil in the Middle East. It's creating a system in which billions of sentient creatures are being killed every year for people to eat. Okay, so it's creating this. So we need to identify those systems, and we need a conceptual language for talking about how those systems work. And then we need a social justice perspective, which is to say that we need to be able to look at those systems and say, wait a minute, this amount of harm is not acceptable. That we don't want to continue being party to this amount of harm. We no longer give permission for this to be happening, and we no longer wish to participate in it. So we need the analysis, and we need a kind of a commitment away from harm and suffering and injustice. And this is really a totally different relation to saying, oh, we need to study forensic science and we need to become lawyers, and so that we can investigate and prosecute crimes. Okay. So let's look at some examples. Okay. So one of the things we've said is that far more people are killed by starvation and lack of medical resources, that are killed in homicides, and even that are killed in wars and genocides, okay? But, we have an international criminal court, we have an international court of justice to deal with international law, humanitarian law. Say, oh, you can't have... people are not allowed to just wage aggressive wars. Governments are not allowed to commit genocide. But the starvation, lack of medical resources, there's no system for accountability around that. And in fact, what happened in the United Nations recently is they put it to a vote. It's like they put to a vote that we need to enshrine in international law that human beings have a right to food. I mean, the most basic, if you have a right to life, you must have a right to the things that enable you to survive day to day. And food and water are the most basic things without which a human body dies. And of course, most of the world, and certainly most of the global south, are like, of course this is a human right. But some countries opposed it. They literally voted against recognizing food as a human right. And of course, we know which countries those would predictably be. It's always the United States that votes against that, because their economic system is a system in which profiting from turning things into a business is more important than making them a right. Making food a business, making healthcare a business, making war a business is more important than people's rights not to be harmed. Okay? We then also see how inequality exists as a system of structural violence, not only being impoverished, but also experiencing racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, experiencing being discriminated against, being marginalized, being denied resources, being a subject of patterns of psychological harm and patterns of physical harm. The individual acts, the individual bullying, the individual assault, yes, that's direct violence, but the system, which then also makes it harder for you to get a job, harder for you to get an education, harder to find a rental, that's a system of structural violence. But they interplay with each other, and structural violence enables physical violence, okay? And one of the ways it enables it, because it enables the people who are benefiting from the structural violence to prevent the harm to marginalized people being criminalized. Okay. The other big example we've mentioned is the suffering and killing of animals. And and that's a huge part of what is normalized into our lives. Another thing is the suffering and death of future generations. What's historically significant about the present is climate catastrophe. We're living in the turning point of it becoming impossible to reverse a spiral of catastrophic climate change. That is going to cause mass death, mass suffering, collapse of food systems, collapse of climate systems in the future, to the point of possibly making the human species not able to survive on Earth. So this incredible act of structural violence, it's being done not only against some people who are alive now, but against everyone who will be alive in the future. I mean, this is a staggering scale to say, well, maybe what we're doing now in terms of fossil fuel emissions and things is literally going to kill the 8 billion or however many people are on Earth. And that we are just doing stuff that is going to have that effect, and it's not a crime, because our criminal justice system cannot comprehend social justice and structural violence. Okay. The other thing that I think is contemporary and worth looking at is that as AI as a system of structural violence. Now, how is AI structural violence? I mean, AI is awesome, right? AI enables you to do stuff really easily. It enables you to find out things. It enables you to automate things. But what we need to understand is that AI operates, once again, not just as a technology, but as within a system of capitalism, within a system that is designed to make some people extremely rich regardless of the cost to everyone else. So that's what's happening with the kind of the AI race at the moment, that these different companies are pushing as hard and as fast as they can for AI to become more and more powerful, because that increases their short-term profits. And they're pushing back against regulation. And the regulation that may be like, wait a minute, we need to make sure that AI is not going to literally kill us all. And they are opposing that kind of legislation. Okay, so AI is structurally violent not because machine learning is structurally violent, but because in a capitalist economy which values profits over the well-being of everyone, it's one of the most dangerous technologies that's ever come into existence. Another specific thing is AI harms the environment. The energy usage, the water usage of AI is absolutely catastrophic. So it's reversing everything we've gained in terms of our technological advances towards renewable energy, solar power, wind power, electric vehicles, all of that. It's just wiping all of that out because of the massive way it's creating this new demand for energy and water, and accelerating the spiral of climate catastrophe through that. The other thing it's doing is AI is increasing inequality and will be increasing inequality. And one of the things that you'll be facing is the much harder employment market. That employment, as we understand it, is going to either collapse or change dramatically if AI develops these promised hyper capabilities. Okay, and what's going to happen there is that wealth is just going to flow totally upwards to the controllers of the AI company, but also that how they generate that wealth is through theft. I mean, AI, the machine learning, its ability to write your essay or write a song or do all of those things is because the AI companies stole everything that people have made for the last few hundred years. Every image, every poem, every book, every piece of scientific research. They just sucked all that up without compensating the people who had produced it, and are now selling that back for the cost of tokens, for the cost of subscriptions. So in that sense, AI is a massive system of labor theft. And now all that labor capacity, all that creativity, all that work is now harnessed inside the AI, the machines, and they can now sell it back to people, even though they never actually had to pay for it. So it's, I mean, in some ways comparable to the theft of labor that happened under slavery for several hundred years. So it's a system of growing inequality which is structurally violent. And then, of course, the great and final threat of AI is the threat of total annihilation. And this is completely insane. This is like one of the most psychotic things about living in the present, is that the leaders of AI company are publicly saying that there's, and they're kind of estimating, because you can't put a number on it, between a 5 and a 20% chance that full general AI, like autonomous AI, will actually end the human race. That it will do stuff. It will be like this kind of Terminator science fiction scenario where the AI is just like, nah, there's no need for humans, and it can't be unplugged anymore. It can't be stopped. It will have just decided to do things that are species terminating. And for people to seriously sit down and say, yes, there's a 20% chance that we're going to end the human race, but our profit margins are going to be fantastic while we do that. This is a staggering moment in history to be living through. And this is precisely what we mean by structural violence, that there will be physical violence, like there will be physical harm. People will become destitute, unemployed, environment will collapse around them. They may be killed by the system of AI. But a handful of people who started out very rich will get even richer. A handful of billionaires will become trillionaires. And this is precisely the relation between inequality and structural violence, and the way in which certain people can decide to put everyone at risk without their consent because it benefits that tiny little handful of privileged people. And so we see, because AI is such a powerful technology, just in the way in which kind of nuclear weapons were very powerful technology when they were first developed, we can see a massive threat to our ability just to live, have basic quality of life, have basic human rights, is in jeopardy. And it's in jeopardy because of a system. And you can't call the cops. There are no crimes that you can say, Sam Altman is doing this crime, arrest him now. Because the law was written to protect private property, not to protect people from social injustice. And so we're left with this realization that to understand harm, we need to go far beyond direct acts of interpersonal aggression to think about these catastrophic systems of harm. And to think about social justice, we need to go very far beyond what is written in the law in terms of criminal justice, and to think about what would it mean to protect people from harm systematically, both now and in the future.